Hi everybody, good evening. Welcome to the webinar. It is Wednesday, January 6, 2016. Tonight's webinar came after a lot of thinking last year. It really came after I'd completed my book and I thought, how can I encapsulate the core ideas that are contained in the book and what my thinking about parenting, parent education is. So I came up with this idea about intentional parenting, and this is the webinar that I did back in early 2015, and I wanted to repeat it again here tonight. The first thing that I want to start off with, something that bothers me, I see this not just confined to parenting, but I see this in a broad scope all over the place with people that are struggling. Sometimes the struggles they have do hurt and affect other people, and I think that's what might lead us to the mocking and the judgment that we have. But part of the idea tonight to begin with is to change our position in relation to those that are struggling from the mockers to the helpers. And here's a couple of thoughts that I had. Appeals for help are often met in terms of parenting with judgment, dogma, and so-called experts selling the next great thing in parenting education, which invariably contradicts the last expert. Advice is not the most effective model for encouraging effective parenting. It's unsustainable and it doesn't perpetuate growth in the client. Let me be clear. Therapists are not experts on your life. Rather, their expertise is in creating the container or experience in which you can discover your truth. So I think in terms of our perception about other people and their struggles and our idea as therapists or just lay people, we have this idea that we know better. And I think part of that is, again, because we're hurt, because we feel threatened, maybe because it makes us feel better than them. I want to shift the idea at the outset of tonight's webinar to this is about compassion. This is about education. This is about learning. All of us come with wounds. And all of our wounds show up in our lives in different ways. Some of those are our symptoms. So if we can remember that, I was just thinking about I was walking through the hallway of my house this evening, reflecting on some stupid decision I'd made some time ago. And I thought to myself, practicing this kind of self-compassion, it was just because you were having a problem. It was just because you were struggling. It was just born out of a weakness. And when I can learn, when I can think about myself that way, I'm much more capable of healing. So I want to start off from a place of non-judgment and support. The first thing that I want to talk about tonight is this idea about teaching parents how to think about parenting. Socrates says, I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think. That's really the goal at the outset of this idea of intentional parenting, is how do we think about these things? Because I don't want to give answers. I don't want to give advice. I don't want to be responsible for that advice. But rather, I want to help pull out, I want to help evoke, if you will, the answer, the truth that lies within you that's hidden beneath shame, fears, doubts, and so forth. I like this analogy because I think it has wonderful application to parenting. Some time ago, I got really interested in Texas Hold'em poker, and I was fascinated by how skillful some players were. We used to play a friendly game with my friends, and what I noticed is the same people would win all the time. And it wasn't about the cards that they got, but there was a skill involved. So my friend gave me a couple of books on poker, and I started reading them. And in one of the books, it was explaining how if somebody asked you, should I raise? Let's say I have 2 jacks in my first deal. Should I raise? Should I just pass? Right? Or should I fold? The question can't be answered without several other questions. How has the table been playing tonight? How much money do people have? How much money do you have? Where do you sit in the order? How have you been playing earlier in the evening? Loose, or have you been playing tight? And so the idea is it can't be answered in isolation. So when a parent, even on these webinars, when they ask me some of the questions like, what should I do? Should I take them home? Should I, what kind of solution, what kind of consequence, what kind of track should I take? My thought is I can talk about the principle involved. I can talk about the ideas involved, but I can't give you an answer because it's more powerfully, more complex than that. It's embedded in all of these questions, and that's why when people say, one of the common questions that I have a difficult time answering is when parents say, how long should my child be? How do you decide on how long the child should be at a vote? And the answer is it's very complicated. Part of it is about when they came in. Part of it is about what you want to accomplish. Part is about their progress. Part is about where they're going next, right? All of that figures into the equation. And without knowing all of that information, it's very difficult. And some of that information isn't even known to you, right? That's why when I'm doing therapy or parent coaching with people, any question like that often results in me asking several questions to learn the context of the question. I think what happens for us when we have these questions, especially when we seem confused or when we figure ourselves to be confused, is that sometimes we're mistaking fear with a lack of clarity, right? Because we want a solution and we want a guaranteed outcome and we can't get it. And so then we become unsure. And then we start going through a bunch of questions about what decision can I make with my child or in any relationship so that I can guarantee the outcome I want. On the contrast, or contrary to that, if we learn to find our truth, to find our core selves, and we learn to speak from that, we have to, at the same time, let go of the outcome, let go of the possibilities. That's called being courageous. That's called being assertive. That's called letting go of the outcome. And that is really, really hard in the context of children that are struggling, because we don't want them to struggle. And some of their struggles can have really adverse consequences. But still, the shift must be back to this place of finding oneself, finding a core, finding out who I am, finding out what I want, asking myself, what am I in control of, what am I not in control of? And for me, the question of why don't you know is important. It's a question that I've learned to ask myself over the years. Why don't I know? Why don't I know what I want to do tonight? Why don't I know what I want to do in relationship to my child's acting out behavior or some mistake that they made or a bad grade or whatever it is? Why don't I know? And then when I start exploring that, I start finding out, well, I think I don't know because I'm afraid that I can't control the outcome. I'm afraid that if I set this boundary, that I'm going to have to actually enforce it. If I set this limit, then it might not get the outcome I want, and so then I'm going to want to capitulate to get the outcome I want. So knowing or coming to understand why you don't know is an important part of this idea of intentional parenting. And of course, I think crucial to many of the questions that confuse us or perplex us is figuring out what's inside and outside of our control. And when we get clear on that, we're going to be much more confident in our ability to act powerfully, to act courageously in our relationships. What I say to parents all the time, I'll use the simplest, most common example that I can think of in my years as a therapist in wilderness therapy. Should I take my child home? Right? That's probably one of the most common, maybe not the most common question on a day-to-day basis, but it's the biggest question that parents bring to me that is very common. And my answer is, it's not about what you do that I'm going to challenge. If you say I'm going to take my child home, I'm not going to challenge that. But I might ask you why. And when I start to hear the answer, I might challenge that because I feel bad. Let's talk about that for a minute. If you're taking him or her home because you feel bad, let's talk about that. Because I want him to be happy. Because I want him to let him know that I trust him. Because I feel obligated to her to give her this reward after all this hard work. Whatever those things are. I'm going to challenge all of those motives. Right? Same in any relationship. In parenting, co-parenting, partnership relationships. It's not the what that becomes the challenge. It's understanding where we're coming from. And if we're coming from a manipulative place, a coercive place, in the examples that I just gave of children coming home, if you're coming from a place of trying to compensate, trying to control how they feel, that's the most common thing. I want him to feel loved. I want her to feel appreciated. I want her to have self-esteem. So I think trust will contribute to that, right? When you start getting in the business of trying to control what somebody else feels, you can almost never make a decision that's going to be helpful to the situation. But when you can make a decision from your truth, from what you know, from what resonates and feels comfortable with your values, with your perspective, with your beliefs, so forth and so on, it's almost impossible to make a wrong decision. So, challenging the why is an important part of it. The idea is to change the question. Change the question from what do I do to who am I? What is this? What do I know about myself? And that's a long answer because that involves my own context, my own beliefs about the world, the rules that I was brought up in, the roles that I was brought up in, how we responded to feelings, how we responded to differences, how we responded to crisis, on and on and on. That's who I am. Some of those things are parts that are a little bit broken. Some of those are very courageous parts and very robust parts. But that's all of who I am, and it's all okay. And I can look at it, and I can understand it. When I have that, in fact, it's necessary. It's impossible to go on to these next two pieces here with any degree of helpfulness until we've answered that first question. So who am I? To the extent that I can answer that, I have the possibility of answering the next two questions. The second question is, who is my child? And what is my relationship to their problems? Right? Who are they? What are their needs? Every child's different. Children change throughout the lifespan. And then what's my relationship to their problem? Do I feel guilty about it? Do I feel like I caused it? Maybe me and mom divorced. Maybe I yelled too much. Maybe I worked too much. Right? Do I have guilt that's lingering, that's going to get in the way of my clarity? That's going to get in the way of me holding them with compassion and accountability simultaneously? Right? Am I going to project so much onto them that I want to give them what I didn't get? I can think of the simplest example, true story, of a father during a graduation visit was talking to his son, and he was talking about sports, and I wanted to play catch with you, and I always wanted to play baseball with you, and I always wanted to do my dad never did that with me. And his son said it in the simplest way. His son said, "Dad, I didn't like sports. That was for you. I liked art." And I know that might be a trite or a simple example, but it illustrates well how often, it happens so much for all of us every day, how often our own history, our own context gets in the way of first seeing ourselves and of then seeing our child. When I think about it getting in the way of seeing ourselves, I think about that idea, that funny saying that says that the fish is the last one to discover water. Because it's just, we know no other context. That's one of the pieces that's valuable about walking into a therapy session with a therapist and experiencing a different context. I can remember years ago going to my therapist for the first times and having her respond to my beliefs that I assumed were just true about the universe, that everybody believed. And her looking at me with this strange, contorted, confused face, like, is that the way you really see it? Huh. She didn't even say I don't see it that way. She was just curious that I had these beliefs that I just took for granted. So when we get out of our context, we can see our context. That's why traveling to other countries can be helpful. That's why going to therapy can be helpful. That's why coming to Evoke for children can be helpful. That's why parents coming to Evoke can be very helpful. It is only when we get out of our context that we have any sense of what our context was and what it taught us. So, learning who we are, then having the capacity to see the other person with more clarity because we can see an other without the projections, and then we can begin to see and understand how we relate to their problems. Am I obsessed with them? Do I try to control them? Do I think it's my job to fix them? On and on and on. Do they haunt me? Do they keep me up at night? Are they evidence of my deficiencies of a parent? All of those things. And when we get clear about that relationship, then we can start to unpack it. Then we can start to unravel it. Then we can become more clear about our parenting. So this is a process. In fact, I wanted to read this tonight. For those of you who might be new to the webinars, I've never read off screen before. But as I was thinking about coming to the webinar tonight, I was thinking about this particular quote, and I don't have any shame reading it, even though it's from my book, because it is not me speaking. It's from one of my favorite psychoanalysts. And I'll read it slowly because it's quite dense. It's from Stephen Mitchell. And he says, the emphasis, speaking of therapy or speaking of analysis, or you can apply this to parenting. The emphasis is not on behaviors, but on rigorous thinking. This is on page 10. Not on constraints, but on self-reflective emotional involvement. Not on the application of general truths, but on imaginative participation. This suggests a very different sort of technique. The discipline is not in the procedures, but in the sensibility through which the analyst participates, or parent or therapist. There is no generic solution or technique. There is a great deal of disciplined thought in the skilled practice of clinical psychoanalysis, or in the practice of parenting, or being in any relationship. There's a great deal of disciplined thought in the skilled practice of clinical psychoanalysis and continual complex choices. So it's on page 10 if you want to look at that later, but I think it illustrates the way that I think about parent education, right? It is a way of being in the world, of being in a relationship. That is why when parents make this adjustment, when they start to adjust their sensibility, they're really adjusting the way that they are in the world and the way that they're relating to everybody. That's why they say to us, this is changing everything in my life. And for those of you that are new, and I know that there are some on here that are newer than others, That's why in the early stages, some of what I say sounds like gobbledygook. Some of it sounds like nonsense. Some of it sounds like abstract and unimportant and off track. And my response is, keep coming, keep listening, watch some of the other webinars, read some of the books that are in our library, work on the parent portal, and eventually it will all make sense to you, like a new language that you just start to understand. The last question then becomes, what do I do? But normally we want to go to that first. I like this idea from Immanuel Kant because it's very philosophical, but it gives us an idea about a way of thinking about our choices. He said, in the groundworks of metaphysics on morals, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. So Kant didn't believe that you could justify the means because of the end. He didn't believe in that. He didn't believe that that could be a right thing. He said in every action, treat it as an end. And so I think for us, what this lends to us for parents, not that we have to adopt Kant's philosophy in our life, but what it speaks to this idea is it honest? Is it authentic? Is it compassionate? Does it come from a place of awareness of self and other? And if it is all of those things, then we can do it. And then we have the courage to walk into something, to walk into a decision, understanding that we can't control the outcome. Just this week, and I have this question asked to me all the time, a parent called me asking questions about our program, asking a lot of questions, and asked the question about making a decision with their heroin-addicted child, whether they should kick him out of the house, he's been through several treatment programs, or whether they should get him into therapy. What should they do? And like always, especially with such an important decision, I didn't answer what they should do. What I said to them is, we have to take you through a process. Let's talk about the principles involved, the thinking that's involved in making that decision. Then let you make the decision. Because the fact of the matter is, I've seen people hold a boundary, kick their children out of their house, and the most horrible things have happened to the children. I've seen parents keep the children in the house, enable them, and the most horrible things have happened to the child. So we can't simply make a decision with this belief that we're in control of the universe and that we can make everything happen. What we can do, what we do have control over, folks, is we have control over finding our truth and asserting it. Finding our truth and demonstrating it. I remember my first supervisor in therapy told this story once or twice. We would watch videos of our sessions. And it was supervision. So I'd bring it to my supervision session, I'd plug in the tape, press play, and he would have the remote control. And after a while, he would stop the tape and he would say, "Why did you say that? What are you trying to do here?" And then I would answer, nervously, wondering, because I assumed that the question, "Why did you do this? What are you doing?" was some kind of veiled accusation, right? That's typically what those are when people ask them. But I asked to my best ability what I was trying to do, what my intention was, why I did what I did, and then he would press play again. And after doing that half a dozen times, I started to learn. He wasn't telling me what to do. He was trying to engage me in a process where I learned how to think and be intentional and aware. When I run staff in service, we have this question all the time. What do we do when a kid swears? Should we cut him off? Should we give him an assignment? Should we give him a timeout? Should we let it happen? What should we do? And my answer is, I can't answer that question. It depends on the student, the moment, where they are in the program, your relationship with them, what the baseline is for them, what you've done the last 5 times that that's happened, right? So let's talk about why. Why might you just put somebody on timeout? When would that be appropriate and why? When might you give somebody an assignment, maybe a writing assignment to talk about it? When might you say nothing at all? Because we can imagine circumstances when all of those responses would be appropriate. And we're learning to think. So the idea is that I don't have all the answers, but I do have a lot of questions. And I do have expertise around a process. That's what we are. We are facilitating a process. We are experts in that process for your child and for you to create a place where you can have more clarity, develop more authenticity, get in touch with the real self, get in touch with your child's real self, start to understand the relationship that you've had with your child and their problems, start to pull that apart, understanding, and get more clear about it. Like I said, it does not give advice. Parenting does not give advice. I was talking to a friend recently, and he was getting advice about his troubled marriage from his mother. Right? He's my age. And I said, at the outset, I have a hard time that your mother would give you any advice. I'm not inclined. I would be incredibly reserved or reluctant to give advice to my adult child about divorce or marriage or what have you. Because I don't know my child's truth. Right? I barely know mine. Right? We're so smart about other people's truth. We know all the answers for everybody else. But we don't know our own? That can't be possible. So I said to my friend, I said, I'm suspicious of the advice, of the wisdom that your mother has, given the fact that she would be willing to give you advice in this area. So I would be skeptical of it if I were in your situation. And I'm not going to give you advice. And we had several conversations around this, and I never even thought. I wasn't holding something back. I've just learned through this process that there's something more important than that. There's something that can help your child and you. And by the way, you're just grown-up children with hair that's falling out and gray hair and wrinkles. You're just a little child that's grown up and gotten older. Time has passed, and you've learned some lessons. But you still are dealing with some of the fundamental wounds that your child has. So the answer, the response to you is to help you, to have compassion, to understand that when you make a mistake, and you will, and you do, and you make them every day, just like your child, can I help you understand? Can I help you see it? Can I help you look at it? Without judgment, without criticism, without me knowing all. You know, you've heard that saying that somebody asks somebody, you know, which road should I take? I came to a fork in the road, and which road should I take? And the answer is, it depends upon where you want to go. Right? That's back to the poker analogy. What do you want? Where do you want to go? What are you trying to accomplish? When I struggle with decisions, I have a couple of people that I call, my wife being one of them, my business partner being another, my therapist being another. I'll call them, and again, it's not that I'm looking for an answer. I'm looking to have a dialogue to sharpen my thinking around this. And you've experienced that too. That's why sometimes people give you advice, and you get really clear in that moment that you're going to go the other direction, because you have, maybe unwittingly, started to understand, this is what I really intend. This is what I really want to do. And part of therapy, part of intentional parenting is it doesn't focus on the content, right? It doesn't focus on whether or not a 22-year-old should be allowed to smoke at his sober living environment who's in recovery for drugs and alcohol. It doesn't focus on that, right? It focuses on your relationship with your child smoking. What's your job there? What do you think your job is there? And where does that come from? And how can you make sure that you're as clear as can be about that? So it doesn't focus on the content, but rather on the process of parenting. I'll talk about that content versus process a little bit later. Intentional parenting learns and values mistakes. Your own mistakes and your child's mistakes, right? We don't overvalue successes. We learn and see the value of mistakes. We don't cringe. We don't run away from. We don't shrivel up. We don't shriek at mistakes. We learn to respond to them patiently. It develops over time, right? We practice this. We practice what we would understand to be a non-trauma response, right? And for me, I learned to practice more and more and more an idea that I think everything's going to be okay. I think we're all going to make it, right? And when I can learn to respond that way, I'm much more flexible and elastic in my responses and much less rigid. So I learned to value mistakes. I learned to take the highs off the high and the lows off the low with regard to my child's mistakes and successes. Intentional parenting is courageous. It's rare and a lifelong pursuit. The things that we are inviting you to do are not common. Right? This is not common information. And not many people are living like this. And some of you are going to resist the call, the invitation to live like this. It's not going to make sense to you. It's not going to resonate with you. It's not going to feel comfortable. But I want you to know that because, and some of you know this, some of you have been doing this a while and would attest to this, and you would say, I'm having a hard time relating to the way that I used to think. Thus, I'm having a hard time relating to my old peer group. I hear parents talk about that. They hear people talk about children in treatment. They hear people talk about addiction. They hear people talk about family problems and therapy. And it sounds different to their ear than it did 6 months ago, 2 years ago. That's a sign that you're starting to walk on the road less traveled, the path less traveled. Intentional parenting does not value the outcome, but rather focuses on the intent. The most simple way that I can describe this is this way. If you congratulate, and this has happened to me, and I've told this story before, if you congratulate me for something my child does, somebody said to me the other day, you must be really proud of her. And my thought was, I'm not proud of her or not based on what she's doing. I'm impressed by what she's doing, but I'm not proud of her, and I'm not disappointed when she's not. I'm curious and worried. But so somebody congratulated me on my son's accomplishment years ago, and I've told the story many times, and I was confused about how to respond. Am I supposed to say thank you? Thank you for that? Why are you congratulating me for something he did? Probably if it was up to me, I wouldn't have accomplished that. That's nothing within my skill set. But if you congratulate me about being honest, if you congratulate me about being patient, if you congratulate me about communicating assertively, if you congratulate me about listening well, right? And I could go on. If you congratulate me about what I've done, then I will say thank you. I remember I was sitting at a baseball game in Fenway Park this last summer, and I was sitting next to a father, and he was doing the most amazing job in the world with this kid that was throwing a tantrum. We were both sitting right outside of the where the seats were by the food, and he was sitting on the chair just right next to me, and his must have been 4 or 5-year-old child, 6-year-old child, right around there, was tantruming. Every possible thing that she could say. And the dad wasn't reactive, he wasn't upset, didn't seem to be affected by the potential judgment of everybody walking by. And after listening to this for about a half an hour, 40 minutes, I said, hey, you know what, I just want to congratulate you. You are doing an amazing job. And he said, I don't always feel like it. I said, you know what I'm watching right now, you're being incredibly patient. I just want to comment on how impressed it is. I don't know that I could do what you're doing. And I just want to congratulate. That's congratulations to a parent. But don't congratulate a parent for what a child does. It's not about you. It's not about the parent. The child is not an extension of the parent. The child is not a reflection of the parent. Right? That's the parent. So that's what I mean by not valuing the outcome. The intentional parenting values the process or the intent. It does not try to control others. It values the other, and it values the development of the self that comes in this messy, curvilinear, crooked kind of path, right? We start to value the development of self. I remember years ago, I've told this story too, true story. Somebody told me, as if it was true, that this father in a farming community in Idaho was at the feed store, and I don't know about farming, so I'll probably get some of the terms wrong, but he's at a feed store. Some of his neighbors came up to him and they said, this thing that you're doing, because when every child turned 12, they got one cow that was theirs to take care of. So his friends, his fellow neighbors, ranchers, farmers came up to him and said, this thing you're doing with your kids, you're making a big mistake. They're not taking care of the cows. And he turned to his friends and he said, you're confused because I am not raising cows, I'm raising children. And he showed that the value was on the development of self, not on getting it right. Because so much of what we learn, of course, is through trial and error and mistakes. Intentional parenting has values, guidelines, and standards, and it's flexible, and it changes over time, and it changes from child to child and situation to situation. Just as I was describing with the staff earlier, when they ask questions about, for example, how to deal with a client or a student who's swearing, it can't be answered generally. Like I read in the quote, there is no general, generic technique, but it is through disciplined thinking. Intentional parenting focuses on the spiritual growth of the parent, right? It understands that you still are growing, that you still are learning, that you're not done. That part of that is about humility. Part of that is about humility and confidence are, by the way, are the same thing. It's having the confidence enough to be humble, to be teachable, to make a mistake, to show up imperfectly. Take coaching and move on. Make a mistake and try again. So it understands and values the growth that a parent is going through. Intentional parenting focuses on boundaries for healthy self-care and expression. Right? One core piece of intentional parenting is that you understand that you're responsible for taking care of you. You're responsible for your happiness. You know that saying, I'm only as happy, a parent is only as happy as the most unhappy child? It's crazy. It's inappropriate. It's an undue burden on the child. Yes, I have 4 children whom I love more than I could ever imagine that I could love. And my serenity, my happiness, my overall peace is my responsibility. And I will be affected. I will feel pain. And I will, through my empathic resonance with my child, I will sense and feel some of their pain. But I will not be held hostage by it. That's the ideal. It focuses on, like I said, it focuses on boundary. It takes responsibility for self. And it doesn't try to be right. Right? This is not about you being right and them being wrong. This is about you being you. Right? So that's why when a father came up to me at the end of a parent meeting years ago and said, hey, do you have some good quotes or research study on marijuana? My son's 21 years old. He's smoking marijuana in the basement. And I want to kind of come with some facts. And I said, you don't have to come with facts. You just have to tell them that you feel uncomfortable with that and you don't support that. And he said to me, I'm allowed to say that? And I said, absolutely. And of course, the reason that he didn't know that, because in his parenting, in his parent relationship growing up, it was about right and wrong instead of about valuing the self. You get to decide what you feel comfortable with. You can, and when we start to justify and defend ourselves, we get on the slippery slope and we enter into an unwinnable discussion. Intentional parenting is easier in the long run. It's hard in the initial adjustment. It's like a flywheel, a giant flywheel. If you were spinning a giant flywheel, the initial phases of it are going to be very, very difficult. But after the momentum is going, it's very powerful and self-propelling and perpetuating. So it's liberating. We start to let go of all of our anxieties, all of the stuff outside of our control. We start to focus on a winnable equation, which is who am I and what's my relationship like with my child and their problems. It takes away right and wrong. I don't have to be right. I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to press every button perfectly for them to be okay. I'm going to make mistakes. And I'm going to forgive myself. And I'm going to let them be angry and disappointed and hurt by me. Because that's a part of forgiving myself. If I forgive myself, of course they can be angry with me. Of course they can be hurt. And so you start to let go of all of this stuff. Old parts of you die and new parts of you are born into it. That is the hero's journey. That is heroic parenting. That is evolving. That is progressing. Intentional parenting is not blame or simple causal and linear. It's not you do this, this happens. We start to see relationships. We start to see a dance. We start to see patterns. We start to see influences and impacts. Right? But we stop and get out of that simple, this causes this. If I do this, my child will do this. That turns the child into an object, not a human being. It takes away all choice. They then are right to blame us. Right? So intentional parenting looks at dances and interactions and influences and impacts and accountability, but does not look at simple cause and effect. So intentional parenting, you value yourself, you value your own journey. That's kind of like the spiritual growth I was talking about earlier. You learn how to have a relationship with yourself and with the thou and others. This phrase down here is a relationship that stresses the mutual holistic existence of two beings. It is a concrete encounter because these beings meet one another in their authentic existence without any qualification or objectification of one another. That's what we're trying to get to. It doesn't matter if your child is 3 years old or if your child is 23 years old. That illusion that we have that there's a fantastic qualitative difference between parenting a 23-year-old and parenting a 3-year-old. Not if you're looking at it in the way that I'm describing tonight. Not if it's about a sensibility. Not if it's about a disciplined way of thinking. Not if it's about self-reflective participation. Not if it's about thinking a different way. Then parenting a 23-year-old, being married to a 45-year-old, being the uncle to a 17-year-old, being the co-worker with a 30-year-old, all of those things start to be the same process. I start to utilize the same kind of techniques. So let's talk about some tools and principles for intentional parenting. Understanding that skills lead to a new way of thinking. Right? So sometimes we'll offer you skills like the communication skills, and I'll talk a little bit about those tonight. Not because we think that is the answer, because any skill, any tool can be used abusively. I'm the best in the world at weaponizing skills. Somebody can take a hammer, which is a very useful weapon, and it can be used to kill somebody. That doesn't mean that the hammer is inherently bad or good in that instance, because it's how it's used and where it's used and why it's used that becomes the important way of defining its goodness or its rightness. So skills can lead us, like a school teacher, they can lead us to a new way of thinking. Understanding also in the early phases of skill development, I like to use the phrase that Harriet Lerner coined, which is called the obnoxious phase. The obnoxious phase of therapy, the obnoxious phase of skill acquisition is when people start to overuse them. Right? They start to use them without the humanity, without the humility. Right? And so you'll do that. You'll find others do that. You'll find your child over-coaching you around communication skills. Right? Dad, you weren't listening. Dad, you didn't use the I feel statement right. That's the obnoxious phase. The more evolved phase is you can hear the I feel statement. And even when the person doesn't listen, you don't become reactive. That's when it becomes more evolved. And that takes a little while. Learning new tools and insights are for yourself, not for your child. Parenting education is to teach parents to change, not to teach parents how to teach children to change. And like I will say later in one of the quotes that I have, the change that is wrought, the change that occurs in parents as they evolve in the ways that I'm describing tonight has wonderful, beautiful impact on all the family. The danger of tools is they become the whole thing rather than making reference to the principle. I see this all the time in our program. Staff get in this habit where they start to use the skills at the exclusion of what's the idea, right? They get locked into one assignment in response to a particular behavior, one consequence for everything. Every time a kid swears, I'm going to put them on a timeout. Every time a child tells a war story, that's talking about romanticizing some old negative behavior. Every time somebody war stories, I'm going to shut it down. And my response is, sometimes let's just let them war story. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about why they loved drugs, why they loved cutting, why they loved fighting. Let's explore that sometimes. Maybe we can even talk about what they might be feeling right now. Because maybe the fact that they're remembering getting high or remembering getting in fights or remembering cutting on themselves or not eating, maybe something is going on with them. And we can follow the trail of crumbs, as it were, back home to the feeling that they're having. So if we only respond to the fact that we don't want children, clients, war storying in our program, we miss all the wisdom that behavior could potentially offer us. So be careful of tools being too much, being the whole thing. Use them as a guideline, a cornerstone, a reference point, right? Like a lot of things, you put them in your back pocket and you use them judiciously. You use them in the way that I described when I gave you that quote on page 10 about after all of the thinking has gone into it. And again, the thinking will become more and more automatic. I should say that. It's like the staff that I work with. The staff in the first 6 months, everything is coming at them. They don't get all of it. They don't agree with some of it. And after being with us for about a year, it's automatic. It's innate, seemingly. Right? It's a process where they think, I know how to respond to this. And the game, speaking of a sports analogy, those of you who like sports, the game is slowing down. Everything seems to be moving very slowly because my mind is sped up and I can see everything. I can see 5 things at once. I can see 5 minutes into the future and 10 minutes into the future. I know myself well enough to know what I'm going to feel like if I do and don't do this. I can feel myself getting angry and upset, which is about my triggers and my stuff, not about the situation. I can take it, right? You start to see that picture evolve. So these tools become a cornerstone that you can use in the context of this kind of higher thinking that I'm describing tonight. And then, of course, avoiding guilt and shame and emotional coercion. Those are the lazy person's parenting techniques. They're lazy because they work sometimes, right? They provide a port in the storm. But in the long run, they don't involve morality. They don't involve healthy relationship. They don't involve differentiation, which is the balance between individuality and connection. They don't give freedom. They don't see the other person. They don't help develop the other person. So we learn to set boundaries. We learn to express our truth. We learn to share. We learn to get more clear. And we stop trying to guilt, shame, and emotionally coerce people into the outcome that we want. That's the hardest thing in the world, is to set a boundary knowing that you might not get the outcome that you want. But the boundary itself is the answer. It is the solution. It is the clear communication. It is the positive self-care. It is the line between me and you. More tools for intentional parenting, therapy. You know, therapy in my book, and you've heard me say, going to therapy is not evidence of being sick, but evidence of health. Right? It's evidence that you want help, that you want to change. And I've said this as many times as I've had these webinars. I go to therapy and have been consistently for the past almost 20 years now. luckily to the same therapist, and have been in therapy much of my life. And it's not because I'm overthinking and I'm not living it. It's because I find it helpful as a reference point once a week to go back, to find myself, to get clear, to take care of myself, right? It's a place where I can go and explore myself, and that's what this space is for. So it is evidence that I want to work, that I want to learn, that I have something to learn. If we can take the shame out of the problem, both our behavior and our child's behavior, we have a better chance at really healing. Shame causes people to hide, period. Shame's impact on us is that we don't want to open up. Shame covers. Shame ignores. Shame lies to us. So we don't open up. We don't get honest. We can't be bad. We have to be good. And all of that might be under that umbrella of good. I can't be weak. I can't be stupid. I can't be insecure. I can't be, make the list. So I'm not going to show it. I'm going to cover it up. And it's going to come out sideways. It's going to come out symptomatically. One of the things that we do is we need, when we practice intentional parenting, we stop measuring our insides with other people's outsides, right? We start measuring, as these are funny quotes or cute quotes, but we stop measuring other people's highlight reel with our behind the scenes footage. And that happens so much in families and in life, right? You look across the street and those people look like they're happy. But you're not in the bedroom when they're fighting. You're not in the house when they're having a crisis, or when they're yelling at each other, or when they're struggling, when they're lying to each other. Right? Those are things that are happening. People, this is real stuff. Go to 12-step meetings. We ask parents to do this. We ask parents to go to 6 of these meetings while they're with us at the beginning. Don't wait until the end. These are more ways for you to develop intentional parenting. The principles and tools, the I feel and reflective listening, please learn that. That's one of the slides that we ask you in the very beginning to look at. The I feel statement, communication and successful relationship. We want you to look at that slide. That's a core principle, core idea, core skill set. And for me, I would just encourage you to use and practice that, say, for the next 20 or 30 years. And see what it does to you. Of course, I'm being facetious, but as you try to do that, as you find yourself thinking that way, as you start to talk in these ways, you'll find that you change the way you relate to other people and you think about other people in all kinds of ways. So changing your you statements to I statements to I feel, I think, I believe, I want, I hope, I like. In my experience, this is what I have found. That's the way, ideally, that we talk to each other. Not, you need to do this. This is the right way. You're screwed up. You need to learn this principle. You need to start behaving this way. Instead of saying, my experience is when we do it this way, this is what happens. I believe that it's a valuable thing to go to school and to graduate. I don't have the experience where I don't have any experience where smoking pot every day leads to somebody getting more clear, more aware, more grounded, more successful. On and on and on. So I statements are unarguable, unassailable. You statements can be debated ad nauseum. Share yourself, your experiences, positive and negative experiences from your life. A lot of parents are worried about sharing negative experiences with their children because they're worried that their children are going to use them against you. My response is, who cares? They're going to find if they're in the mode to find excuses, they're going to find it. And my children know about a lot of my mistakes as teenagers, and as a parent for that matter, but as a teenager. And I've never thought one time that they would use it against me. And if they ever have, the few times that they might have, my response is, okay. So you're using that as an excuse, but here's my boundary. See, I don't have to be right. The excuse, they're not wanting to share it because we don't want them to use it against us is from the paradigm of being right and wrong. And I don't need to be right. I just need to be me. So it's okay to share your struggles. And you might need some coaching around that. You might need some help around that. You might need to check your intention around that with a professional or with a mentor or with a sponsor. I like sharing the undone stories. I talk about this all the time. Don't give your child a lecture on peer pressure. Share with them where you still struggle with other people's judgments. Share with them where you still haven't figured it out. You still worry about what the neighbors think or what others think. and don't come to a conclusion. And what you will find is that your children will start to lecture you on peer pressure. You'll hear the lecture and the wisdom that you wanted to offer them. Because the fact of the matter, it's difficult. And we're not intellectually incapable of understanding the lecture of the idea of peer pressure. We're emotionally struggling with it, not intellectually, not cognitively. Avoid imperatives. Avoid have to, need to, ought to, must, should, right, wrong, good, bad, evil, got to. My goal in my relationships is to never use any of those words. I would say I do pretty well, A-, especially in therapy, especially in these webinars. I find myself occasionally, even when I wrote my book, I went back through it and I took out every phrase that said we need to, we have to, you must. So try to find a different way to talk about it. Usually it's in the form of the I statements, like I think, I believe, this is my experience, here's what I want, here's what I need, here's what I feel comfortable with. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I just want to use the communication model to emphasize the difference between process and content. Meta-message refers to the meaning of the communication or the message beneath the message. This meaning could be intended consciously or unconsciously or inferred consciously or unconsciously. Meta-messages come from context, roles in the relationship between sender and receiver, nonverbal cues or covert agendas. Meta-message can be contrasted with syntax, the study of the units of language, without reference to their meaning, and pragmatics, the study of the relationship between the symbols of language, their meaning, and the uses of the... So it's what we mean. Oftentimes we can discover the meta-message by asking ourselves tough questions about our intent. As we practice communication skills training, we improve our ability to recognize the meta-message in others and in ourselves. Healthy communication includes improving the similarity, the sameness, between our words and the intended message. Sometimes the meta-message becomes clear by subsequent discussion. For example, the question why is often an invitation to debate the validity of a feeling rather than the surface level syntax suggests of asking for reasons. In other words, right, I do this all the time. I use the shaming why with my children. Why did you do that? I don't mean why did you do that. I mean you shouldn't have done that, you idiot. My wife will tease me and say, Brad, you might as well put the phrase you idiot at the end of your question, why did you do that? Because that's what you're really saying. And she's right. So we start to understand what we're really saying. Why are you telling me this? You told me 3 times how you feel about me not going to see your I'll use that in a little bit. Somebody just Michael just gave me a private question, but I'll talk about it when we go over the question. We start to understand what we're saying and what we're intending to do. So that's what we do when we start to become aware. Understanding meta-message is important because many of the insights and pitfalls in communication occurs beyond our conscious awareness and lies in the meta-message. Many of the following principles make reference to meta-message, what it means or may mean when we say these things. So we all know when somebody says something but they mean another, how frustrating and infuriating, how crazy making that can be. So the more intentional, the more clear, the more conscious we become around our communication, the more we're becoming clear about our intent, about what's going on for us. That's why a lot of therapy is communication training. Finally, principles and tools. We're learning to set boundaries, setting boundaries instead of all the other stuff, which is threatening, philosophizing, hoping, pleading, resenting, complaining. Why do they treat me that way? They can't treat me this way. You can't treat me that way. None of that is boundaries. What do you feel comfortable with is the measure. Right? What I mean by that is I want you to remember this. The best way to set a boundary with your child or with anybody is to say, this is what I feel comfortable with. This is what I need in this relationship. Should I give them money for college? Should I send them to treatment? Should I support them coming home? All in all, this is what I feel comfortable with in the end. And again, then you sort that out and you bounce that off a professional, a mentor, a sponsor that you trust so that you're clear about where that feeling has come from. But in the end, that's all you have. You don't get to be right. Because next week, the University of Minnesota is going to refute the last study from the University of Wisconsin, which refuted the study from the University of Southern California the month before. So all you have is what you feel. It's the most powerful way to parent with boundaries. This is what I need. This is what I feel comfortable in this situation, in this context, in this exchange. We learn that control and fear is the opposite of letting go and love. Right? I want to get you to eat your vegetables, so I'm going to threaten, I'm going to plead, I'm going to bribe, I'm going to do everything instead of just setting a simple boundary. Right? I'm going to threaten to leave my alcoholic husband instead of setting a boundary. Because the threat is the attempt really to get him to do it instead of a real boundary. Get ready for the change back. That's another Harriet Lerner, the Dance of Anger author, idea of get ready that other people in your lives are going to ask you to change back. They're going to give you energy to change back. It's going to feel foreign to them. It's going to feel like a betrayal to them. It's going to feel distant and cold. It's going to feel contrived. It's going to feel fake. It's going to feel foreign. So all of that stuff, they're going to try to guilt you. You're not a loving mother. You don't care anymore. You don't love me. Get ready and prepare for the change back. And change the discussion from the moral to the practical, right? That's the way we parent teens and young adults most effectively, is we don't talk about morality. We say, I don't think it works to be cruel to people. I don't think it works to steal. I don't think it works to cut corners. I don't think it works to do crack. I don't think it works in the long run to cut. In the short run, all of those things work. But in the long run, my experience is it doesn't work. Or else I would have handbooks on how to smoke crack and how to cut on yourself. So the discussion becomes practical. It becomes about the child in the world, not the child against you. It's not about you. See the limit that separates their life from yours. I've talked about that a little, but they're not a reflection of you. They're not evidence of you. There is a dance. There is an impact. But their successes and failures can be theirs. You can turn them over to them. And then you can take responsibility for yours. It cares, but is not caretaking or rescuing. Right? It allows people to suffer. It allows people to hurt. It allows people to feel angry, sad at us. It has a curious stance to it. Right? We become more curious. We become curious about what's going to happen. How's this going to work? Like I've told the story where my son came to me telling me that he lied on a job application when he was 18. And I could just tell he was waiting for my lecture. And I said, I'll be curious how that turns out. A week later, he comes back to me and he says, I told them the truth. And I said, what happened? They fired me. I said, why did you do that? He said, my buddy told me I was being an idiot. But I was just curious and watching him learn. We focus on what we can control, what's inside of our control, and we stop making our life about what's outside of us. Right? Internal locus of control says, what I do makes a difference about my happiness. External locus of control says, what happens to me defines my happiness. So it's a shift from what happens to me to how I deal with it. We have less anxiety. We have more serenity and peace as we develop the skills and the tools. We find an internal sense of direction and validation, oftentimes starting with a peer, and we stop using our child as a reference point about whether we are doing good or bad. If our child's happiness, frustration, sadness, anger, even struggle is the way we measure our goodness as a parent, understand as clear as I can, that means that they're parenting you. That means that they're training you. That means consciously or unconsciously, they're learning what your buttons are and they're pressing them, consciously or unconsciously. So we have to find other people to work with, parents and peers and people that we trust, professionals. This is a courageous and a heroic, because the idea of the hero's journey, the idea of heroic parenting is that we do difficult and painful things. And the most painful and difficult thing that we do of all is we look inward. That's what the hero's journey is. You know Star Wars that just came out and all the Star Wars before then? The heroic journey is always inward. So that's what this is asking us to do. We start to use these questions, these tools. We ask ourselves why. What do I want? What's my goal? What's within my control? What is my intention? And I start to understand my meta message. What do I really mean? Why am I asking a question? Am I really making a statement? Is my statement a question? Am I really trying to shame them? Am I trying to make them feel guilty? Is that why I'm telling this story? Is that why I'm giving this example? Is that why I'm talking right now? So we start to understand what we really mean. And what is the outcome? We have a relationship with our child. That's the reward. We have a relationship with our child between us and the other that is sustainable, that's tolerable, that's not crazy making or less crazy making. In some ways, this intentional parenting is easier. In some ways, it's harder. It's more painful. It's more frightening at times. It requires more courage. It requires more effort. And in some ways, it's effortless. And in some ways, it becomes easier and easier. We develop an inner peace. We develop the idea of radical acceptance, which is the idea of stop fighting reality and accept what is. That doesn't mean we don't act. It just means we stop thinking it shouldn't be this way. I shouldn't have an alcoholic son. I shouldn't have a daughter who's cutting. I shouldn't have leukemia. I shouldn't have multiple sclerosis. I shouldn't have a friend who just died. I shouldn't have been fired. I shouldn't have. And we start to say, I got fired. I have this disease. My best friend died. My child has a learning disability. Now what am I going to do? That is the lesson, and that is what life is. That's the flow. That's what I need to deal with. But when we get stuck on what should be, we never get to learn the great wisdom and treasure that struggle has to offer us. We see the opportunity. We learn to and automatically begin to surround ourselves with healthier people because we don't resonate with those old ways of thinking and talking. We start seeing the little value that guilt and shame have in anybody's life and the toxicity of it. And we start to understand that morality comes from a place of learning how to feel and then recognizing that humanity in others at the same time. That's really what morality is. You understand that guilt and shame, when we look at it in the world, people are doing all kinds of horrendous things out of guilt and shame all over this planet and have for centuries. But if people can learn to feel and become authentic, they will sense and be responsive and sensitive to others. That's morality. We develop new ways. This is kind of an innovative way of thinking. We have less anxiety and depression, more hope and empowerment. And finally, we look at the 3 C's. We look at what we can control, and we understand that our relationship to our children and their problems is we didn't cause it, we can't cure it, and we can't control it. When a parent says, but I did all of this, they say this to me all the time, but I did all of this, or pretty well. I'm not perfect, but I was a pretty good parent. My response is, congratulations. You must have a great deal of peace. Serenity and peace are the result of healthy parenting, not well-behaved children. The question you have about getting it right suggests that doing it right causes someone else to change. I'm sure you are great, and your child's struggles are not about you. Their struggles are their own. And going on further, parenting skills and principles don't change children. They change parents. And that change in a parent can have a wonderful impact on a child. Good parenting is its own reward. Good parenting is good living. It means being a better man, woman, person, friend, self, boss, or employee. Healthy parenting is the end, not the means to an end. And finally, you can't do this without help. I can't do it without help. You need somebody outside of your context if you're going to do this. You will begin to ask yourself deeper questions, and you'll allow the others to ask you deeper questions. You'll learn to explore your issues and your childhood, because that is wherein a lot of the difficulties in our lives lie. You'll learn to understand how trauma, big T and little t, have affected you, and how a lot of our knee-jerk, impulsive, unconscious responses come from that trauma place. We'll get away from the shame paradigm in the end. And you will make your life your project. Not your child's life is not your project. Your life is your project. And you'll take the burden off of them to make your life your project. And in other words, they won't be carrying around your self-esteem anymore. They can't. It's too heavy. This is a quote from a wonderful book by J.D. Gill called Letters of Juliet to the Knight in Rusty Armor. And she came to this realization in a relationship with her husband, who she thought was a despicable man. She learned in the end, nothing needs me to rearrange it, shape it up to my own advantage, or triumph over it. And we start to learn that. We start to have a different kind of relationship with everybody in the world, not just our children. So, I might have time for a couple of questions, Michael, and we might have to save some of the leftover ones for our next webinar. I'm still confused as to why we shouldn't be proud of something our child does. Yes, we don't take credit for what they did, but there are things my kids do that I feel proud. Maybe I feel impressed instead. Can you go through feeling proud again? Yes, thank you for that. This is one of the things that's pretty maybe unique or personal to me. I don't like the word because it seems to imply that it's about me. I like words like I'm impressed, or gosh, you can be proud of that. But I am proud of is like me walking around like I am proud. There's something about it to me that has a quality that it's about the parent. It's loaded. That's the way I think of it. So this is not a right or a wrong one. This is just my 2 cents. And I would rather, when a child does something well, I get curious. I get interested in them. I look at their response. One of the ways that I talk about this is don't cheer so loud from the audience of your child's life that they pay attention to the audience instead of their own life. When I was in Little League as a kid, when my family would cheer in the stands, I would become distracted and self-conscious instead of just playing the game. So I'm wary of it because it's loaded for me. It's loaded about that it's about me, that it means something about me. Instead, I would say to my child, gosh, that seems like something you could be proud of. How do you feel about that? What was that like for you? And by the way, why should my pride of them be the reinforcing feature in their life? This is about their life anyway, right? And for me, again, this is all just my opinion. This is not one of the core principles. This is just a flavor for me. If I can be proud of them, then I can be disappointed in them. And for me, that's not something I'm inclined to feel either. Sometimes I'm sad, I'm worried, I'm concerned. But disappointed has such a value and such a weight on it that it makes it about shame and it makes it about me. So that's just where I come from about it. That wouldn't be something that I would correct every parent. It's just a flavor, an inclination on my part. And when I work with people, I almost, once in a while, I have no other word for it, once in a great while, but often, most often, I talk about how they feel, what they can think about it, how impressed I am. Remember this, when we overpraise, children tend to cheat or try easier things to maintain their place on that pedestal. That's from the book Nurture Shock by Bronson and Merriman, the chapter on praise. So too much praise leads children, we know this from the research, it leads children, or a certain kind of praise leads children to cheat and try easier things instead of trying harder things. So that's another thing to be aware of. Can you give an example of a real boundary, please? A real boundary. I'm leaving, hanging up the phone, leaving a conversation, sending a child to a wilderness therapy program, taking away their car. It's an action. I always say a boundary is a boundary is a boundary. Most of the time we talk about it, threaten it. And it's okay to set a boundary and say, if you don't go to treatment, I'm leaving you. I mean, you can say that to somebody, right? If you don't stay sober, you can't live in our house. You can say those things. Those aren't threats. They become threats when it is the thing that we say to try to get them to change rather than, this is my boundary. I can't live with somebody who uses. I can't live with somebody who beats me. I can't live with somebody who abuses the children. I can't be in a relationship with somebody who talks to me that way. I can't. And then I execute it. I don't say that. I know that I go back to this story because it was so powerful. It was the one with Jeff Bridges and Maggie Gyllenhaal. The Weary Kind, I think is what it was called, or maybe that's the name of the song. Anyway, where he was an alcoholic country singer and she was his girlfriend and he was an alcoholic and he screwed up so badly one time he almost lost her child and she finally just left him. And then years later when they got sober and they got back together, there was a part of me that said, well, can't you get back together now? He's sober and he's healthy, he's been sober. But she didn't leave him so that he would get sober. It wasn't her job to get him sober. It was her job to take care of herself. It was her job to set a healthy boundary. In the book, the best book that I've ever read on boundaries is The Dance of Anger by Harriet Lerner. And we have a webinar on that. And she uses the example of an adult woman saying to her adult father, I can't do this for you anymore. And she had to feel all the guilt. She had to face all of the guilt. But she had to do what she needed to do to take care of herself and her growing family. So, it's an action. It's a stance. It's not a threat or a discussion or a philosophizing. I wish the I feel statement could be used in the business world, or can you? What about applying these principles in our daily lives to impact the larger state of the political world? Do you have an I feel statement for your civically, politically connected self? Yes. Yes, I do, and yes, I think it has application. Now, it doesn't sound as therapy rich when I talk this way, but when I'm talking about other issues, I talk about what I think and feel and believe. I talk about what's going on for me. I own my stuff. I talk about my intention. I talk about all of the things in the I feel statement, but it doesn't sound rich. It takes a while to practice it. So I think there is a place for it, and I think it is a healthier way of being in the world. All right. few announcements, and then I'll close it up. Intensive workshops, and I also have new parent groups in some places. Heroic Parenting, that's the workshop. Our January date is full. All our January is full. So the next one is in February. That's Finding You. That's any young adult or any adult. Anybody who's an adult can go to the Finding You in February. We have the Try to Parent workshop. We want all parents to go to that if possible. The ones on the right are deeper, more personal work, 4 to 8 individuals at a time. The one on the left is larger workshops, experience education. Both are wonderful. Both come with rave reviews of the participants. Here's upcoming parent, and then I'm going to go to Chicago in March, and I'm going to go to Houston in March, April. So that's my commitment. I've said it long enough, and you can hold me to it. Los Angeles, I'm going to be there Monday, January 25th. There's the address and the time. In the Bay Area, some of our other therapists, a few of them actually, are going to be running the Bay Area parent meeting on the 27th from 7 to 9. There's the address there. New York City, we will have one in January, and then Chicago and Houston are coming up in February and March. So I'm looking forward to that. That's all for this evening. The next, Pursuits Trip. Oh, sorry, I have a couple more slides. Pursuits Trip. This is high adventure for families. Go to our website to find out more. Please go to 6 of these meetings while your child is with us. Follow us on social media for announcements, events. You can get my book. The last of the hard copies are at Barnes & Noble, and then on the 19th of this month, we're shifting to paperback. And then the next webinar, this is important for all of you. We try to do this once a month, maybe once every 5 or 6 weeks. So this is for siblings on Monday. That means any sibling of any age can be invited. Please invite your children who aren't at Evoke or haven't been to Evoke if they want to ask questions. Have them submit questions in advance. Have them come. You can sit with them if they're younger. You can help them type. Tell me their age when you get on. So we usually have between 7 and 15 siblings. It's wonderful. It's also not just for siblings, but it's also for me. If your sibling can't or doesn't want to attend, it's an opportunity to model how I would respond to some of the siblings' questions too. So please join us for that and encourage all the siblings at home to join us then. All right, folks. That's Monday the 11th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope this was helpful. Have a great evening and a great weekend, and I'll talk to you on Monday. Bye-bye.